portrait of Mr and Mrs Baggett, painted by Stanley Spencer between 1956 and 7. Commissioned as a single portrait of either sitter, Spencer chose instead to paint Mr and Mrs Baggett, a garage proprietor and his wife, together in their Highgate dining room, with its view of the churchyard and Highgate School. The folds of fabric in Mrs Baggett's clothes, as well as the velvet curtain behind, suggest a comfortable setting for her. Apparently Spencer rejected a pattern dress for Mrs Baggett, as the time taken to paint it would have increased the cost of the picture. Nevertheless, he embarked on a painstaking depiction of knitted cloth, comparable to that seen in Portrait of Eric Williams, in which he is known to have spent much of the allocated time on the knitted stitches of the sitter's sweater. The result is that the knitting takes more prominence than it would have had with a pattern dress as the backdrop. According to Kitty Houser in her book on Stanley Spencer, published by Tate in 2001, Spencer's initial drawing was the most important part of his working practice, and he viewed the painting process, particularly of his later works, as tedious as knitting. However, he does seem to have had a fascination with the craft of knitting. You can imagine the clicking of the needles in this portrait. Here, the creation and growth of cloth, the magical transformation of wool yarn to fabric, is Mrs Baggett's story. Wearing a serious expression, she has direct eye contact with the viewer. Mrs Baggett occupies more of the canvas than her husband, who appears in the bottom corner, gazing outside the frame, wearing formal clothes, jacket, shirt and tie, and preoccupied with a business telephone call. Especially at the time the portrait was painted, knitting was generally viewed as a mundane, domestic activity undertaken by women, thereby of lesser importance than a husband's role in business. But it is Mrs Baggett who appears the dominant character in this picture. Repetitive features of the brickwork, the railings, the tombstones and the pearl necklace complement the nature of knitting. A similar delight in texture is revealed in Study for the Month of April, Clipping Privet Hedge, sketched in 1926, where the beautifully clipped hedge echoes a knitted piece.